Hello everyone, this is Professor Moore, and I'd like to introduce you to a brief little mini crash course on critical approaches to literature. In the next couple of minutes, and it will be a brief video, what I'm going to do is tell you what a critical approach is, how you might be able to use a critical approach in literature, and what are 3 examples of those critical approaches. So first, I'm going to advance here, and I'm going to show you basically a visual that might help you to understand this. So the first thing to keep in mind is this, that the text, as we've talked about here and there, is always the text. The text doesn't, we're assuming it doesn't change, although texts do change. Editors make changes, publishers make changes, things like that. But we're going to assume that it just stays the same. A story is going to be the same story, whether it's published now or in 10 years. So let's just assume that the text doesn't change. But one of the things that we always do when we read a text, and we do this with any language because language is flexible and open for interpretation, not completely open to interpretation, as any lawyer will tell you. The law does say certain things, and certain things are not stated in the law. But because language is open and playful and flexible, we bring our own interpretations to that text. So what a critical approach is it's like a set of lenses there, as you can see, like a certain tint or a shape or a prescription. So what it does is it doesn't change the text, but it helps us to see certain things in the text that maybe we wouldn't see otherwise. So it obscures things, or it highlights things usually. It helps them to be a little crisper. And so, in a sense, what you can say is this is a way, best case scenario, of seeing hidden meanings in a text that otherwise doesn't change. So it helps you to kind of perceive a text in different ways. One of the takeaways of this, once you kind of master this idea of critical approaches, is that you can use this on anything. You can use this in cultural artifacts, or cultures, or human beings. So you can see different things that are maybe hidden in people, if you will. But we're really just going to confine this to reading a short story or any literary text. Okay. So the first of 3 critical approaches that I'm going to introduce you here to is called myth. Now, myth can mean many different things. So when you think of myth, you might think of images like this, ancient stories that are made up and powerful and interesting. There are, of course, scads and scads of myths that might come to mind, and images and stories. But really what this is getting at is how we can use a particular kind of a lens or a particular way of understanding the world to apply to a story, for example. And so the modern critical approach to literature through the myth perspective is inspired by the work of Carl Jung, who's a psychoanalyst, largely in his book Man and His Symbols, and also by one of his followers, Joseph Campbell, who wrote a very famous book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Also, for the past 200 years, there have been academic studies of folk tales and classical myths. And so out of all that sort of tradition, and I'm just naming a couple here, comes a particular interpretation that can help find these sort of hidden stories or hidden meanings in stories. And so the first and perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind about a myth is that a myth doesn't necessarily convey literal truth. It doesn't make a claim that this actually happened. So I have no problem calling the Christian creation story a myth, because we cannot prove that scientifically, nor does it matter that much to many people. It conveys something that is truthful, and a myth is like that. So it's not necessarily that it's wrong or incorrect. It's that whether or not it literally happened or not might not matter as much as the truthfulness of that general story. So, and that might be an adjustment for some of you to kind of think about, but myth can be used that way. So myth often looks at, it focuses on archetypical figures, archetypes. These are like figures. These are basic kinds of characters. And some of the traditional ones, you don't have to know these, but I'm just listing them there, are the crone, an old woman, a wizard, a guy with who's older, who has knowledge and power, a princess, a scapegoat, one who's blamed for something, a trickster like Loki or Brer Rabbit, or a doppelganger like an evil twin or something like that. These are typical or archetypical figures you find in lots of traditions and lots of different forms of folk tales. So if we can just take one of those archetypes, probably the most famous one and most prevalent one is called the young hero. The young hero archetype is sometimes called a monomyth. I think it was Joseph Campbell who coined that phrase, the monomyth, because it presumably can be found in so many traditions and it's found all over the place. So this is how the young hero archetype works. First of all, remember, any story that you come across can be boiled down into a very, very basic essence. You could do that with a complex work like the Bible, or sophisticated language and wordplay in Shakespeare's play. You can boil it down into a basic story with basic figures, and that's how the myth works. The myth approach works. So when you boil that down into basic, if you're the most generic, general, vague interpretation of a story, you can use myth. And here's how you might use the young hero. So this is the essence of the young hero archetype. And you find this in a lot of stories. And maybe you can think of some pop culture stories or some traditional folk tales. But whether it's publishing or Hollywood or just urban tales, you will often find a young hero archetype that goes something like this. There's a young figure, male, female, human, or an other, who leaves home to face a great evil or a nemesis or a challenge, a struggle or battle, engages in that. It could be violent, it could be mental, it could be physical, whatever, is victorious on some level. That doesn't mean they have to vanquish the nemesis, but they have to come away with some sort of victory. And they return home wounded, transformed, mature, entering into adulthood, and bearing some sort of token of this adventure. Oftentimes you have a symbol, an object, a sword, a ring, a scar, something that bears the token of this rite of passage into adulthood. So that's kind of sophisticated, but if you use it at that level of generality, you can find that in lots and lots of stories. I challenge you to kind of think of one right now. And as you're thinking about that, we'll turn to the second of the three critical approaches that I'm going to offer to you in just a few minutes here. The second one is psychoanalysis. When you think of psychoanalysis, you might think of something like this. A person talking about their dreams or their frustrations or whatever's on their mind, and it could lead the listener to understand this person a little bit better, how they put the world together, why they tell the story in that order, and that sort of thing. You might think of images like this, about dreams or nightmares or something like that, or even something that's surreal. Maybe you've had very vivid dreams that are colorful and detailed. Maybe you haven't. But somehow these kind of images might come into your head while we talk about psychoanalysis. But as a critical approach, I just want to touch on a few things about psychoanalysis. So first of all, this is largely inspired by the work of Sigmund Freud, a man who pioneered psychoanalysis just over 100 years ago in a very early book called The Interpretation of Dreams, and later by Civilization and Its Discontents, and various other works. And one of the central ideas of psychoanalysis, and again by application, psychoanalytical critical approaches for literature, is one of the central ideas is a belief that the psyche, that is our sort of mental constructs, our mind, is constituted by two different levels of awareness. The boundary, we might think, is very crisp between conscious and unconscious, but instead, many psychoanalysts, and I tend to agree with this as well, believe that that boundary is very fluid. So think about daydreaming, for example. If your brain is wandering off, you're kind of flowing back into this unconscious state of mind. And what we think of as conscious is maybe not as conscious or as aware or as alert as we might think. And so maybe to help visualize this, you might see Freud's iceberg here. So we tend to think of the conscious mind as being aware of thoughts and feelings and pain and pleasure and that sort of thing. And then what's happening underneath is all these other things that we conceal, as you can see, but we might not conceal that even consciously. We might cover it up somehow. The psyche often covers up to protect or because it doesn't understand. And so when we say we're aware and alert, that only reflects the tip of the iceberg and maybe not all the other unconscious or subconscious things that are going on. So to add to that, and maybe you've heard some of this before, and if you took a psychology course, the source of each person's life energy, according to psychoanalysis, is called the id. Freud termed it the id. The id is this thing in your psyche that hungers for pleasure and satisfaction. You can never stop it. It is a life energy. It will always hunger for satisfaction and pleasure. You can never turn it off. In its sexual dimension, the id's drive is known as the libido. You've heard that phrase, I'm guessing. And so this is called sort of a sex drive or something. It's one of many pleasure drives, but it's one of the most basic ones. And again, you can, Freud would argue, you can't turn that off, but what you can do is maybe redirect it. The libido drives every human's cathaxis. This is a great college word, which means basically where you focus your energy. So if you're obsessed with something, that's a form of cathaxis. If you're trying to read a story that demands a lot of attention, that's cathaxis. If you're doing a workout before your training, that's cathaxis. It's physical, it's mental, it's emotional. Libido is redirected, not to focus explicitly on only sexual fulfillment, because we live in a civil society. This is what Freud says, we are animals, and animals cannot control themselves. So what we have are laws and rules. When we redirect cathaxis, libidinous cathaxis, it's known as sublimation. And so if we use psychoanalysis as a critical approach, it can help us to understand the unconscious tensions and motivations in characters. It can help you to understand why someone does what they do, and these are called subtexts. The last of the three critical approaches is called gender. And when you think of gender, you might think of something like this, you might think of something like this, right? Well, whatever you think of, here's how we're going to approach it here. So sex and gender are different and related categories. They're two different things, but they're related. So this is, again, for the purpose of this introduction, sex is basically one's identity, and everyone has an identity, based on hormones and reproductive organs. It's not race, it's not socioeconomic level, it's based on hormones and reproductive organs. Gender is socially constructed, and it's a set of roles usually related to sex. So somehow it's related. I won't go into how that might be related, but it's really sort of a social role that's often based on sex. Gender, what's important to know about gender in here is that it's always concerned with power and how characters fit within a system of power. So if you, some stories will look at patriarchy, which is a social system of power that privileges males. And so if you're looking at a female character in a patriarchal society, there's obviously some tension, and it has to do with power. Oftentimes a power differential. Here are a couple of terms which you might be aware of that are associated with gender studies and the gender approach to literature. One is phallic symbols. A phallic symbol is not a penis, but it often is suggestive of a penis. It could be a scepter or a sword, a mace, a gun. Sometimes those symbols suggest patriarchy. And so you might see those in art and literature, in a story, for example. Reductivism is when people and characters are reduced to basic stereotypical gender characteristics. Of course, people are not just characteristics, they're complex. And so when a story challenges those boundaries, it's called queering. That's the only way we're going to use that. There are other ways of looking at queering, but that's what that means, challenging those boundaries. And masquerade is the last and maybe most important term here. It's a belief that all gender is a kind of performance. So think for a moment that you are an actor in a play, and just like in theater, gender is constructed by the interplay of scripts, actors, costumes, makeup, vocal performance. At every moment of the day, you are a representation of your gender, and characters in stories that you read are representatives as well. and I hope that helps. Take care.